All right, we are on question number 2 on the back side. Most of the exponential equations you have used in this chapter have been in the form y equals a times b in parentheses and then to the x power. So even though you have not seen this form before, all of our equations have looked exactly like that. We've talked about what each of those things meant, but we just haven't specifically talked about the equation yet, the standard form. So what does the a represent in this equation? So the number that's in front of that parenthesis, what was that always? A was always our initial value. So earlier in the week, it was the amount of rabbits we started with. Today, it was that initial height of the bridge. What does the b represent in this equation? My b is my growth ratio. So my b equals that growth ratio. How can you identify the a value? By looking at the table. So starting out with how can we identify it by looking at a table? Well, it is always across from the 0. So when x equals 0, it's my y value. So I wrote here exactly what I just said. So when x equals 0, it's the y value. So you just look in the table and you find y when it's your y value. And that is exactly the same thing for the graph. So I'm just going to write table and graph here. So in the table, you find when x is 0, and it's the y value, and the same thing for the graph. When x is 0 in the graph, it's your y value. In the equation, it's a little bit different, though. So how can you identify the a value by looking at the equation? Well, my a value is going to be what's in front of the parentheses. So it's the number in front of the growth ratio. And lastly, question D, how can you identify the b value by looking at the table, the graph, and the equation? So with the table, we can identify the b. So that b value is a first number multiplied by the growth rate to get a second number. So as you can see here, I wrote it's the number multiplied by a y value to get the next y value. So it's my number, my multiplier, that I multiply by a y value to get my next y value. In a graph, it's pretty hard to tell what the b value is. So we're not going to talk about that right now, but we will talk about it later in the unit. So then to go to the equation, we can identify our b, or our growth ratio, because it's the number in the parentheses. So it's the number in parentheses. All right. So it is the number in the parentheses.